20 столітті Україна стала ареною колосальних воєн, кровопролиття. І тут було так багато крові і болю, що фактично сформувалось таке, знаєте, окремішне ставлення кожної з етнічних спільнот до власного горя. Тобто ми маємо купу таких локальних етнічних драм. І як ми сьогодні з вами говоримо про те, що ми сповідуємо загальнолюдські цінності, а найвища людська цінність – це життя. Як ми говоримо з вами про те, що ми прагнемо розбудувати українську політичну націю, то в такій країні не може бути місця Голокост як трагедія тільки євреїв і пам'ять для євреїв, Голодомор – трагедія українців і пам'ять тільки для українців, депортація кримських татар – трагедія кримських татар і пам'ять тільки для татар, тому що це все є наше спільне горе, наша спільна історія. І осмислення цієї історії, за цим стоїть наше майбуття. І я надзвичайно з великою приємністю хочу представити вам нашу другу панельну дискусію «Голокост у контексті міжнародного права та академічних досліджень». І ми маємо справді блискучих науковців, людей, котрі мають світові імена, люди, котрі прибули до нас просто з різних країн світу, але всіх їх поєднало бажання бути з нами тут, в Києві, в ці дні, і прагнення донести до світу правду про трагедію Голокоста, Бабиного Яру. Учасниками нашої дискусії є професор Філіп де Лара, Франція. Я думаю, що Філіпа нема навіть сенсу представляти українській публіці, оскільки він досить активно виступає в нас. І це є один із найкращих спеціалістів з дослідження проблематики тоталітаризму, філософ відомий. Це також професор Норман Наймарк, Сполучені Штати Америки. Також це для нас велика честь сьогодні вітати Нормана Наймарка. Кілька років тому ми мали можливість представляти його книжку про сталінські геноциди, але це справді, очевидно, один з найкращих спеціалістів в царині дослідження геноцидів, Голокосту. І також я представляю нашого польського колегу, третього нашого доповідача. Це Інститут політичних студій Польської академії наук, це Крzysztof Персак. І ми маємо тут блискучий такий тандем модераторів, серед яких професор Гольчевський і професор Максим Гон. І я надаю з задоволенням слова нашим модераторам, котрі поведуть дискусію. Вона буде тривати, як і попередня сесія, 1,5 години. Дякую.
So my talk has as a title "The Tears of the Horrendous Events in Kiev During the War and of the Crucial Importance to Transmit the Memory of these Events and Their Sequels on Survivors and Witnesses." And what we discover in the book, and what Maryslav probably had a feeling when she read the notebook, is not only a raw document, the kind of fact account that a witness might give to a detective or an historian. In fact, this book is a masterpiece of, let's say, narrative tapestry, combining notes taken on the spot of, as he says, everything that I saw, heard, and everything I knew on Babyn Yar, personal recollection retrieved later, both from the period before and after German occupation, other witnesses, for instance, interviews of Dina Pronicheva, newspapers, leaflets, etc. The whole is a novel document, as Kuznetsov labeled it, and it achieves the tour de force of being true to the perception and voice of childhood, and at the same time to expand this childish voice by the powers of adult knowledge and artistic creativity. My childhood bathed in lie. chapter begins like that. This sentence embraces, obviously, all the narrative of the book. It sounds both as the immediate sensations of a child and as a synthetic, reflective statement on Soviet life. Lie is everywhere in the book, from the Germans telling the Jews they were rounded up for transportation in labor camp, while they drove them to Babyn Yar for immediate killing, to the prohibition in USSR of specific mention of Holocaust after the war, the complete blackout of the site until 1966, which was broken thanks to the pressure of dissidents, among them Viktor Nekrasov, Ivan Juba, Tina Pronicheva, and my friend Leonid Finberg. The erasing of the ravine decided by the party in 1957, which led to a huge 5 years earthwork. And in March 1961, the dam built to fill the ravine broke, and a 10 meters high stream of mud and water rushed down to the Podil, destroying everything and killing a lot of people. The number is still unknown, and the authorities managed to conceal the event very successfully. And Kievans used to say then, says Kuznetsov, reports Kuznetsov, Babyn Yar took its revenge. My childhood bathed in lie. It is worth telling about the context of this sentence. We are before the war, in 1937, for the 20th anniversary of the revolution. And Postitchev, a close associate of Stalin, proposed to reinstate the custom of the Christmas tree in schools. But since Christmas had been abolished, the kids were told that the tree was brought by Postitchev, and Postitchev was then a hero for children at school. But 2 years later, they were asked to tear out the page of the school book with the portrait of Postitchev. And Kuznetsov reports, Postitchev had become an enemy of the people, and he was shot, although he had brought the tree. For our child brain, this was a shock, but they did not allow us time to think about. It became fast a system, something ordinary and usual, damaging school books. It was funny, and everyone enjoyed it hopefully. This little piece of nothing, an episode told through the child's eyes, offer at the same time an explanation of a crucial feature of totalitarianism, what Jan Gross labeled much later as the privatization of power. Everyone is an informant on everyone. You cannot lead a normal life without getting involved, accomplice. Schools and mass organizations supervised everyday life from the cradle to the grave. Population was driven to subdue itself. I should say population is driven to subdue itself, but people were not as much constrained to do so as gently trained, starting from childhood. And like Gross, Kuznetsov shows that the consent to totalitarian rule is not a question of opinion, that is, people believing or not believing in Bolshevik or Nazi ideology, but a question of social settings, social habits. With the simple expression, everyone enjoyed it awfully, Kuznetsov let us realize the ability of the regime to manipulate people, to corrupt them, and to make them accomplices of their ugliest crime. Most of you know who was Postitchev, but I cannot resist to remind you the bitter irony of his fate. This great humanist, benefactor of children, was one of the architects of the Holodomor, after and before several bloody offices. And like many high-ranking perpetrators of Stalin crimes, he was eliminated in 1939 after the Great Terror on the phony pretext of Trotskyist conspiracy, and he was rehabilitated by Khrushchev. And I just learned yesterday, thanks to Ukrainian of Kiev, Stanislav, that the street where I live now, Malashitomirska, used to be Postichev Street after the renamed like that after Stalin's death, and this name remained until Ukraine independence. After all, it's legitimate because he was totally innocent of a Trotskyist conspiracy. Another piece, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. There are a lot of books, but many of them, however better informed, are less illuminating than the recollection of the teenager Kuznetsov. Kuznetsov felt then, and shows in the book, how these 2 years of Soviet-Nazi friendship entailed far-reaching consequences, not only on, let's say, military and geopolitical issues, but on Soviet society. First, the lack of military preparation. During the first bombings, he tells, people ran in the street and the helpless officers of civil defense had no idea where to send them. There was no shelter, only holes in some courtyards. We were content with thinking, if the war comes tomorrow, a very popular tune at that time, but we were expecting to go to war abroad. Second, the pervasive lie already mentioned was increased at that time by a thick fog of confusion and disinformation of the public. Fascism was the enemy, but Nazis were our friends. Anatoly and his friend, Yorik, used to sneak up without paying in the October movie theater. They saw many films between 39 and 41, but the newsreel footage was for a very long time always the same. Vyacheslav Molotov visit in Berlin. We understood, writes Kuznetsov from this film, that Soviet Union had no better friend than Hitler. The Soviet people had Stalin, then came Hitler. Molotov went to Berlin to sign a friendship and non-aggression agreement. He was welcomed by bands, flowers, ovations. Hitler's troops' parade was magnificent. Military music was fascinating. Hitler welcomed Molotov with fraternal warmth and shook his hand for a long, long moment. They talked with animation, and around them there was a flock of photographers and flashes. Then the impressive military parade again. The flags with the swastika, so male, so close to us. In such an ideological mess, people were disoriented. The entire Judeo-Bolshevik propaganda found, paradoxically but very understandably, a fertile ground. The Jews themselves, the Ukrainian Jews, were confused, misled, even if they knew about the condition of Jews in Germany, and many of them did not even fear the German invasion. At first, they had to change their mind very fast. So, what is important in what these examples displays is following. We are on the threshold of the disappearance of all the direct witness and survivors of Holocaust, not to mention the Holodomor. This is a strange situation, sad, worrying, but nevertheless natural and even comforting. An era is closing. The condition of historical scholarship and memorial policies will change dramatically one way or another. For instance, in my country, France, the participation of Holocaust survivors is a pillar of educational and commemorative programs. But life goes on, it's natural, and it's even a wonderful thing that survivors could lead a normal life. Not all of them could. That is, transmit not only their terrible experience, but everything a human being can give to his heirs and to his contemporary fellows. Among them, the historians of Holocaust were able until now to link archives and living testimony. And it is very gratifying to know that transmission occurred, that people knows that life won in the end. But this natural and so nostalgic passing of time has presently a special flavor and value. The last moment before the vanishing of the witnesses put on the fore the uniqueness of the testimony of children. 3 writers, to my knowledge, have best used and accounted for the richness of children's testimony of Holocaust and huge human disasters in general. Anatoly Kuznetsov, born in 1929, the novelist Aaron Appelfeld, born in 1932, and the historian Szymon Redlich, born in 1935. Most of the novels of Appelfeld deal with Holocaust, his own child experience of horror and survival, and the question as how to cope with this as an adult. He still considers the family home in Chernovitz and his grandparents' house in a Carpathian village nearby as his homeland. I take it everywhere, so I still have a home. I still have parents, grandparents, nature, forests. Bukovina is a beautiful wooded country. He writes that in 2000, and yet this homeland ceased to exist for him in 1941, when his mother was shot by German soldiers and the 9-year-old Aaron taken with his father to a concentration camp. Redlich is a respected and renowned scholar in the field of Jewish and Soviet history. You met him yesterday evening at the screening of Shimon Returns, and he is chairing a session of this symposium tomorrow. He is a great person, and I love him. Born near Lviv, he was 5 when the Soviets invaded Western Ukraine, then Poland, and 7 when the Germans attacked Soviet Union. With his family and later on his own, he survived to Holocaust thanks to Polish and Ukrainian peasants. His books, together and apart in Berezhany, draws heavily on his own child experiences. And his book, like Kuznetsov, his book, like Kuznetsov, manages to make listen the voice of children and to bring the best of their impressions, recollection, however partial, sketchy, or confused, along with archives. I will just quote some words of Appelfeld, which match perfectly Szymon's writings as well as Kuznetsov's. The experience of children were different of the experiences of grown-ups. Children suck the horrors not through their minds, but through their skin, intuitively. They were not able to think, to rethink, to evaluate, to analyze, while the adult survivor spoke about what had been before the war. For the children, the Holocaust was the present, their childhood and youth. They knew no other childhood or happiness. The Holocaust was the black milk, as the poet said, that they sucked morning, noon, and night. Appelfeld refers here to a famous poem by Paul Celan, Todesfuge, Fugue of Death, written in 1945. Black milk of daybreak, we drink it at nightfall, we drink it at noon, in the morning, we drink it at night, we drink it and drink it. So says Appelfeld, children sucked the war years through their bodies. There was a need for some kind of unmediated relationship, simple and straightforward to those horrible events. Truthful to childhood is not only a tribute to nostalgia, piety, nor a matter of sticking to true facts. It has its own power for unearthing facts, reaching new insights and understanding of the events. Our three authors display this power in different but equally striking and beautiful ways. The Soviet and the Nazi totalitarianism took lessons from each other, helped each other, be it with or without intention. We are still working to understand how and why, and the vision of a child, I refer to Kuznetsov, had immediately grasped this monstrous and overwhelming reality. Thank you very much.
Шановні колеги, ми маємо визначитися стосовно того, чи будемо задавати свої питання відразу ж після завершення доповіді кожного із вчених, чи вже після 3 доповідей. Після, так, є пропозиція після. Гаразд, тут відбувся дуже швидкий консиліум, вирішили, що питання прозвучать після завершення всіх доповідей. Прошу.
Okay. First of all, I'd like to thank the organizers of this really quite wonderful event for inviting me. It's a real pleasure and honor to be here, and I want to thank especially Marynovych for all of the 1,000 emails she sent to make sure I would get here on time and be here. And so I'm really pleased to be among you, and this is, it was a beautiful morning. I want to thank those who were involved in the morning session, you know, for really moving time. Okay, I'm going to talk about the theme of our session, the Holocaust in international law and academic research. There's not a lot of time for extensive remarks, so I'm going to confine myself to 4 propositions related to the theme of the panel as I see them, and then try to defend those propositions. So let's see how it goes, and I'll just cut myself off at the 20 minutes I've been given. So proposition 1 is historically, the Holocaust constituted a crucial set of events in the development of the Genocide Convention, and therefore in creating the international legal structure for prosecuting and convicting criminals of this terrible crime. The second proposition is that the character of the Holocaust, that is the mass murder of the Jewish people in Europe, and the overall racial policies pursued by the Nazis in Europe, also determined the stated targets of the crime of genocide as it was defined in the Genocide Convention in 1948, and those targets were ethnic, religious, national, and racial groups. Third, the overwhelming influence of the Holocaust on the framing of the Genocide Convention has led to a number of tensions within the genocide studies community today. Let me mention just a couple of them in particular. Between those who believe that the Holocaust should remain the central paradigm for genocide and the locus of scholarly effort by genocide scholars, and those who think that comparative genocide studies should not be focused so concertedly on the Holocaust. There's also a tension between those who think the 48 definition should constitute the be-all and end-all, as it were, of our efforts to conceptualize genocide in various directions, and those who believe that the definition can and should be expanded in various ways that I'll talk about. And finally, the tensions that I described about the influence of the Holocaust on the origins of the Genocide Convention are also there in international jurisprudence. Questions and unaddressed issues, of which there'll be many, to the discussion. The first proposition should be relatively unproblematic, and that is that the Holocaust was crucial to the passing of the Genocide Convention. But it's important to point out that Raphael Lemkin, whose biography most of you, I hope, know as a Polish Jew, educated in Lviv, Lemkin understood that there was something called genocide before he actually coined the term genocide in his 1944 book, The Axis Occupation of Europe, and before there was a Holocaust. In other words, he could conceive of Holocaust before such a thing happened. He was moved by the events of the 1915 Armenian genocide, though of course it was not called genocide then, it was called a catastrophe, or the greatest catastrophe ever. And he deplored the similar massacre of Syrian Christians in northern Iraq in 1933. Lemkin was convinced that international law was the only answer to attacks on minority peoples by their own states and political elites. And already in 1933, he proposed, as you may know, to the League of Nations, or Association of International Lawyers of the League of Nations, a law against the crime of barbarism. And barbarism was essentially genocide that came later. And I quote, "Whosoever, out of hatred towards a racial, religious, or social collectivity," let me underline social collectivity there, "or with a view of the extermination thereof, undertakes a punishable action against the life, bodily integrity, liberty, dignity, or economic existence of a person belonging to that collectivity, is liable for the crime of barbarism." End of quote. So again, we have a definition, 1933, of what is essentially genocide before there was a Holocaust. Still, it took the events themselves to focus the world's attention on the crime of mass extermination. And Lemkin, as you may well know, was crucial in forging that 1944 definition. He coined the term, and then working the halls of the United Nations as a lobbyist to have that convention passed. Nuremberg played a role in the publicizing of Nazi crimes, but Lemkin had little influence over the judges and their conclusions, which barely mentioned genocide at all as a term. Now the question then of the targets of the crime of genocide. There's no question that Lemkin himself and post-war international society, to use the Hedley Bull concept of international society, was deeply impacted by the Holocaust, even if the kinds of crucial role that it plays in our thinking today was not apparent after the war and didn't really grab even Western societies until the late 1960s and certainly in the 1970s. Lemkin, after all, had lost much of his family in the Holocaust, and by the time he defined the term genocide in 1944, he seems to have given up on the idea of including social and political groups in that concept. The UN itself dropped its own concerns about social and political groups, which was expressed in the UN General Assembly Resolution of 1946. And it dropped it primarily under pressure from the Soviets, their allies, and others who worried about their own records of repressions. In other words, this narrower ethnic, religious, national, and racial definition of who are the targets of genocide was deeply influenced by the fact that there was a Holocaust and that Holocaust was in front of everyone's eyes. Now, the tensions in the study of genocide. As I mentioned earlier, there are serious divisions within the genocide studies community that derive from the overwhelming influence of the Holocaust. And one of our tasks of this panel is to talk about academic research. For a time, the Holocaust was equated with genocide, ignoring many of Lemkin's fundamental insights, not to mention the preamble of the Genocide Convention itself, which many have overlooked. The preamble of the Genocide Convention says, and I quote, "recognizing that at all periods of history, genocide has inflicted great losses on humanity," end of quote. In In other words, genocide is something that belongs to world history. I'll be talking about that more tomorrow. It took really a long time for historians of the Holocaust to admit that perhaps the Armenian genocide of 1915 should also be considered genocide. And even longer for comparative genocide studies to find roots in the social sciences, something that really only happened, I would argue, in the 1990s and into the new century. These differences have lessened over the years. Still, we have two genocide associations. You know, I don't belong to either one, so I claim perfect objectivity, of course. One which tends to focus more on the Holocaust and the impact of Holocaust studies on all of us, and the second one which insists more on the comparative aspect of genocide and has been accused by the other people in the other genocide association of diminishing the importance of the Holocaust. So this remains, by the way, a very lively issue which was just played out in Israel at a recent meeting of the Comparative Genocide Association. There's also a division in the genocide studies community about the word genocide itself. Some scholars would like to drop it altogether in favor of a series of very academic-like terms: sociocide, politicide, genderocide, and any side you can think of. Obviously, I don't think much of that proposition. Others would like to hold on to the 48 definition. Some, I confess, like myself, would like to expand the 48 definition to include social and political groups. Others are desperately opposed to that idea. I'm not going to go into those arguments right now, but I had in mind in particular those groups which can't strictly be defined in ethnic terms, who are pursued and murdered by Stalin. And the Holodomor strikes me as one of those examples. But also groups like homosexuals or the handicapped who were isolated and attacked by Hitler. Whether one agrees that these cases were genocide or not, in my view, and it's shared by some colleagues and not others, these attacks should be considered part of the history of genocide. Finally, a word about the jurisprudential consequences of this kind of issue relating to the definition of genocide in the 1948 Convention. If genocide is considered the crime of crimes, and there's also an argument among academics whether it should be considered the crime of crimes or not, again, I'll relay my own prejudices. I think it should be. I mean, some consider crimes against humanity and war crimes as equal to genocide, but in point of fact, I don't think that works in the jurisprudence. Then the perpetrators of the Cambodian genocide should be tried and convicted for genocide. I mean, why do we call it the Cambodian genocide after all? Before the hybrid courts that are now meeting in Phnom Penh. The problem is that the Khmer Rouge murdered primarily Cambodians. In other words, the crime of genocide only fits in Cambodia when they murder others, like the Kham or the Vietnamese, or maybe Buddhist monks. But even though the vast majority of the Khmer Rouge has 1.7 million victims out of a population of 8 million, I mean, think about that. That's a huge percentage, right, of the population that were murdered by the Khmer Rouge, were Cambodians. This does not qualify as genocide by the narrow definition, and has to be tried for the lesser crime of crimes against humanity. There's the case of Comrade Du, excuse my Cambodian to those who know it, who ran the Tuol Sang prison camp, where 16,000 Cambodians were tortured and then murdered, is an important case in point. He was initially prosecuted by the Cambodian hybrid courts, as they're called, for genocide and convicted of genocide. That conviction was then overturned by appeals courts, which gave him a lesser sentence of 19 years for crimes against humanity. But then the victims and Cambodian society was so upset by this that the courts then reversed themselves and gave them a lifetime conviction, but again of crimes against humanity. In other words, that the courts in the Cambodian case, unlike some unusual courts around the world, the Estonian courts, for example, Argentinian courts, and a few others have said that no, genocide can be based in a social or political group. Mostly international courts say no. Historians don't necessarily have to go by the rules of international courts. And in this case, I disagreed with how they considered that genocide. Many other cases of genocide had this same issue or same problem. Shouldn't it be called genocide when the Indonesian government and army attacked and murdered nearly 600,000 Indonesian communists in a concerted effort at eliminating them in 1966? As I said, the Argentinian and Estonian courts have taken their prerogatives to indict and convict for genocide co-nationals, of murdering political groups or other co-national groups. This argument, by the way, goes on and on. It continues and will continue for a long time. Thank you very much.
Okay, so I'm honored to be here, and I'm really grateful for this invitation to this magnificent conference. I was very deeply impressed by the first part and deeply moved with the initial presentation when we saw the Babyn Yar photographs. And since I was asked to join this panel, just at the very last moment, I don't have a written presentation to read. So what I think I could do is to share with you some remarks concerning some recent developments on Polish historiography of the Holocaust, particularly in the respect of the issue which is probably the most touchy, the most delicate, and the most difficult, which is the complicity of local people, not the Germans, to the Holocaust in Eastern Europe. We have such a debate behind us in Poland, and this very strongly contributed to the developments of historiography of the Holocaust. But let me start with the picture of Polish historiography we started with in the end of communism, in the moment that we regained our freedom, including freedom of speech, including freedom of thinking, and including the dissolution of the state censorship, which was a very important factor. And when Poles became more self-confident in their own country, which allowed them, which enabled them to speak not only about the heroic part of their history, but also to touch the black pages of their history. Practically, during the whole post-war period, Holocaust, the destruction of Polish Jews, was treated as something different from national history, as something which is apart from our history. It was a history of others, not a part of Polish national history. Actually, we were quite schizophrenic about it, because Poles, as probably most of the nations of Eastern Europe, considered themselves as the biggest victim of the war, as the nation who suffered most. And every Polish child knew the number that 6 million Poles perished during the war. And it's a number that is very well fit in the national historical consciousness of Poles. But no one reflected on it that half of these 6 million Polish citizens were Polish Jews who perished during the Holocaust. So we're lacking a reflection that Holocaust is a very, very important part of history of Poland as a nation, as a state, as a political nation, not only in ethnic respect. But also I don't think that most Poles reflect every day on how much important was what happened on Polish soil, or the soil of pre-war Poland. I'm not going to discuss the tricky Polish-Ukrainian issues in this, but anyway, what happened on Polish soil during the war? What's the significance? What happened to the history of the Holocaust? Another proportion is that half of the European Jewry who perished during the war were citizens of pre-war Polish Republic. So the history of Holocaust was in textbooks of Polish history was not very exposed, was not very well present, and it was rather a domain of research of a specialized Jewish historical institute. So history of the Holocaust during the whole post-war period was kept in some kind of a historical ghetto. And if something was discussed, it was the German crimes on Jews, and the attitudes of Poles. And we had this self-portrait of brave Poles who did a lot to help Jews, to rescue Jews, and they were very, very courageous. We always remember that there are 6,000 Polish writers among the nations who have their trees in Yad Vashem. And what was admitted, not eagerly, that there existed some traitors, some people who denounced Jews, some people who blackmailed Jews who were hiding during the German occupiers, but this was a very marginal phenomenon. These were people who were also traitors, who were collaborators, so we excluded them from our notion of our Polish community. This picture, which was very strong in Polish consciousness, became to be undermined in the late 1980s when some discussions began in Poland. It was towards the end of communism, and the state censorship was not very strong. They allowed more freedom of discussion. There existed also clandestine, anti-communist newspapers and books which were published independently, which also raised these issues. And a very important factor was screening in Polish TV of the Shoah film by Claude Lanzmann. This film showed the eyewitnesses of the Holocaust, among them the Poles, and it brought some kind of a shock to the Polish public, because these people showed their indifference, their lack of compassion, lack of sympathy to the Jews. So this was something undermining the picture of universal solidarity with the Jews during the Holocaust. But Lanzmann's film raised a lot of opposition in Poland. It was very much criticized that it is unjust, that it shows untrue picture of Poles during the war. However, this was some very important beginning of this discussion. Another important voice in this discussion was an article by a very eminent literary scholar, Jan Błoński. It was published in Tygodnik Powszechny, an intellectual weekly, in 1987, if I'm not mistaken, where he also he called for more open discussion, for that we should not look for justifications, that we should look more openly into our own attitude to the Jews during the war. But when he reflected on the Holocaust, he said that maybe not everything was all right between Poles and Jews during the war. But we didn't take part, we didn't participate in this crime, meaning the Holocaust. He even wrote, God stopped our hand. We didn't, we were not complicit to it. And this, what he said, became obsolete when in the year 2000, Jan Gross' book on Jedwabne was published in Poland. It was a small book where Jan Tomasz Gross, a Polish-born scholar living in the United States, described a case when the Poles took part in a pogrom or massacre of Jews in 1940. 2 minutes only? Okay, so let's make it 3. So Gross described a case when Poles murdered Jews, and it was a shock. It was a great shock, and it sparked a great debate in Poland because it was something unimaginable. We believed that we were only the victims of the war, but we were never perpetrators. But when Gross described this fact, that in a certain place, particularly it was a very specific place and very specific time, because it was at the very beginning of the Barbarossa operation, when Germans conquered the area was previously occupied by the Soviet Union. Gross undermined our self-portrait as victims only, but it was still considered as an incident. But what we learned also, we learned that there exists a great volume of sources which were not used by historians for decades. These are the files of the trials of collaborators which were conducted in the first years after the war. We learned that there were 20,000 such trials in post-war Poland, and only 1/4 of the people who were accused were German war criminals. The majority were local people who were accused of crimes or of being collaborators of the occupiers. And these new sources, which started to be explored after Gross' book, in recent 10 years, brought a very important development of the historiography, because based on these sources and based on the post-war testimonies of Jews, of Jewish survivors, which also were kept in the archives for many years and were not very much explored, we learned a very different picture, that the people who helped Jews were not representatives of the majority of the society, that they were rather non-conformist people who broke the socially adopted rules that it's too risky to help the Jews, that there is no social consensus to help the Jews. We also learned about many examples of crimes perpetrated by ordinary people during the war, not like mass crimes like Jedwabne, but individual denunciations, individual murders committed during the German occupation. And this is what is very, very new and probably not yet absorbed by the Polish society, by the Polish national consciousness. but it is not only absorbed, not only learned, but also it causes some defensive reactions. And that's what we are witness of in Poland now, that after the recent elections, the right-wing government follows a policy of opposing what they call pedagogics of shame. Should not speak about the wrongdoings that Poles committed during the war. So this debate, this struggle about the Polish memory of the war and Polish memory of what happened between Poles and Jews during the war is still going on. Thank you.
Not at all suggesting anything of that sort, but I feel like the Holocaust has the benefit of having all the archives open, and you can say definitively this is genocide, whereas the Holodomor, people say, well, not quite, even though Raphael Lemkin said so. So I'm wondering, you know, it's a very complex question. I wonder if you could address some of that.
It is a complex and good question, and there's a complex and long answer, but I'll try to keep it to time. I mean, I think all of the history of genocide and the evaluations of genocide have to be historicized, meaning being put in their time and in their place, and how historians work and how society works. So, I mean, a good example is, again, the Holocaust, which was frequently denied, right, in the 1940s, late 1940s. Among Germans, a third of the people, you know, in the late 1940s and early 1950s didn't think there was such a thing as a Holocaust, right? You wouldn't have anywhere near that kind of result today. I mean, what has to happen is societies have to change, people have to think about it, historians have to write, you know, and if you take the history, as some of you know it, of the way Germans looked at the Holocaust, for example, I mean, now it's completely different, right? I mean, even contemporary German national identity is based on the fact that they were criminals, right? And that they did this, and that, you know, in very positive ways, I think Germany has changed. And Tim said something this morning, too, to this effect that, you know, the societies itself have to absorb what happens. I mean, I can tell you I wrote about the Armenian genocide in a 2001 book on ethnic cleansing. And in that, I said, honestly, you know, that I wish the documentary basis were better to prove the Armenian genocide. Well, I caught it from the Turks, of course, on the one side, because they don't think there's any Armenian genocide, but I also caught it from the Armenians, who said, how can you say something like that? And in point of fact, looking at the documentary evidence that I had, and not able to go to the Ottoman Empire, archives, and read Ottoman Turkish, not to mention Turkish period, you know, I didn't feel like the evidence was so overwhelming. I think you can say something similar with the Holodomor. The historiography is relatively fresh. It's relatively new. I mean, Ukrainian historians, you know, are turning out very important things based on documentary evidence. So I'm convinced, you know, and I wrote about it in the 2010 book, Stalin's Genocides, and if you read what I write, I say Holodomor is genocide. Other people are not convinced. And I think what has to happen and what will happen, you know, is an increasing involvement and more study. I mean, I've been arguing with some people back home about it who disagree. There are going to be some publications coming that say there is no Holodomor. You know, everybody was treated the same during the famine across the Soviet Union. So you're going to continue to confront doubters. You know, built into every genocide, there's denial. And it takes a long time and a lot of work and a lot of discussion, you know, for that denial to be overcome. And so I believe, in other words, that Holodomor belongs to the history of genocide and is a crucial and integral part of it. Others don't. You know, for some of the reasons I mentioned today, but others just don't think it was, you know, you can separate it out from the overall killing or death during the famine in 32, 33. I hope that answers your question.
Absolutely, thank you very much. It's just, I think it's a a common ground that I think the
absolutely.
Ukrainian Jewish encounter can be built on. So thank you.
Шановні панове, я дозволю собі одну рефлексію, оскільки ми ведемо мову про геноцид і Голокост, зокрема в контексті міжнародного права, мені здається, що ахілесова п'ята вітчизняної історичної науки полягає в тому, що, вивчаючи Голодомор, ми наразі не зробили кроку далі, ніж друкувати спогади жертв, і майже не вивели тему Голодомору до проблеми міжнародного права. У нас наратив на теорію практично не лягає, і, можливо, це одна із причин, чому кваліфікація Голодомору і геноциду на сьогоднішній день в Європі, в світі, не так далеко зайшла, як би нам хотілося. Будь ласка.
Excuse me. I'm Jack Margolin here with U.S. Fulbright Program. First of all, thank you for your talk. I think it's very instructive and important in terms of applying our study of the Holocaust to broader understandings of genocide, mass atrocity, and kind of related to those issues of definitional issues and practical application of the word genocide. You touched on this in reference to everything from the Holodomor to the Cambodia genocide, but I'm curious as to your opinion in regards to moving forward and our continued use of the word genocide. I should say that I agree with your opinion that restrictive use of the term, restricting our concept of the word genocide hinders our understanding and our ability to address these kind of events. Do you think that we are better served by perhaps a political or definitional elevation of the concept of mass atrocity, or rather purely by expansion of the term of genocide in order to encompass these events that would otherwise be excluded, but which are, of course, very much worthy of historical and political analysis and treatment? Thank you.
That's a good question. By the way, I didn't answer part of that question. Who was the gentleman who asked that question? There in the back. I forgot the Lemkin part. Lemkin did write a piece in the early 1950s saying unambiguously that Holodomor was genocide. The problem with that piece is not that what he said was wrong, but it was the way it was expressed. It was really expressed in a ferociously anti-communist way, and in the context, you know, of a campaign done by, I can't remember, the Association of Free Peoples or whatever it was called, you know, the sort of the peoples who were fighting for their freedom, as it were, against the Soviet Union. It was done in such a way that it was really polemical. Unlike most of Lemkin's work, which was, you know, sort of very lawyer-like. And so that piece itself, when you read it, is not going to be convincing to terribly many people. But you're absolutely right. That's what Lemkin said and thought and at that time, and I agree with his fundamental analysis there. You know, to your question about the mass atrocity, there is a book, and I'm blanking at the moment of the author, who has made the argument. A lot of people don't like the word genocide. The reason they don't like the word genocide is that every people who feels like it's been hurt in one fashion or another say, you know, how about our genocide? And my argument in response is a lot of you have been hurt, and a lot of those peoples really do deserve the appellation genocide. And I'm going to give you one quick example a book that just came out by a former Yale PhD on California Indians. Well, this is something most of us in California didn't know very much about, still don't know very much about until they read this book. And you realize, you know, that 90% of the California Indians were wiped out between, you know, 1850 and 1890. I mean, it's an unbelievable story. And people are gradually going to absorb the fact, you know, that California Indians, almost all of the tribes were subjected to genocide. Mass atrocity as a term, you know, I think there are ways that works and ways that it doesn't work. And what, you know, some people want to do is combine, again, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide, the three crimes that the International Criminal Court was set up to deal with, and equate them under the idea of mass atrocity, and sort of diminish then the differences between them. You know, I think that's a mistake. In other words, I think there's, and the Holocaust teaches us this, and actually the Holodomor teaches us too, that there's something about going after a group as a group. You know, there's something about identifying groups of people by characteristics they're supposed to have, but don't really necessarily have. You know, somehow they're all linked together in this group, attacking them as a group and eliminating them as a group. I think Lemkin really found something. You know, he really discovered something about human behavior that's different than, for example, a crime against humanity. There's a very good new book by a man named Philippe. Some of you may have read it, about Lviv, and this other lawyer, Lauderpact, who was also trained in Lviv as a Polish lawyer, Polish-Jewish lawyer. And Lauderpact was very much against the idea of genocide and believed in the idea of crimes against humanity as crimes against individuals. He didn't like the idea of groups. And you can see that argument. And that argument, by the way, goes on again in genocide studies itself. So it's a good question, but I personally tend to not like, it's not as if I don't like, but the term mass atrocity doesn't work for me.
Шановні колеги, у нас є ще третя доповідь, яка прозвучала в контексті академічних досліджень, і зараз я прошу дуже лаконічно формулювати питання тих, хто має їх до професора Кшиштофа Персика. Будь ласка.
It's always about the notion of genocide. In the usual sense, I don't speak law. Genocide, it means the intentional destruction of a part of a population, which means for what they are and not what they did, and includes children, wife and children. So I had a discussion recently about Katyn, because a friend of mine told me Katyn was a genocide. And I told I don't think so, because I heard about this usual meaning. It doesn't mean that Katyn is not a terrible thing. Just there was not women, wife and children. I don't know if you agreed with that. And my second question is that we saw that in France we had a lot of controversies about the intervention of states about recognize these historical events as a genocide. And I think that we have opened a Pandora box because I think that the states have political interest and not historical interest. Now it's too late, we have opened this box. But I think it's really a problem. So I would like to have your idea about that.
Okay, I try to be very brief in my answer. The problem with the notion of genocide is that in current discourse, public discourse, it became more a political term, not a legal term. And I'm very attached to this legal meaning, that it's a crime which consists of destroying a group, a part or of a whole of a group as such. And this as such is very important at the end of this legal definition of the 1948 Convention. And concerning Katyn, so the problem is, as genocide became a political term, and it's compared to a pattern, of Holocaust as a model genocide, but also a modern example of evil. So there are some groups, some nations which want, in parentheses, want to be victims of the Holocaust because it compares them, it equals them, victims of a genocide, because it compares them to the victims of absolute evil. So it elevates them as victims. And other nations want to call, and the perpetrators are also compared to absolute evil like the German Nazis. So that's the problem. And that's why there are discussions and there is some willing in some nations to be called victims of the Holocaust. And that's the problem with Katyn. So there is a tendency, and political tendency in Poland, to call Katyn massacre a genocide. And I think that's the political line of the government is that we want to call it genocide. My personal opinion as a historian is that we cannot qualify Katyn massacre as genocide because the victims did not form any homogeneous group in the meaning of the convention.
Okay, if I could just say 2 words, it'll be more than 2 words. But the second part of your question, I absolutely agree with you. The genocide should not be the product of a political resolution in a Congress. I won't sign anything. There are lots of petitions to have, they're in the United States to try to have the Armenian genocide recognized by states. And I don't want to, I don't believe that states should get involved in it one way or another. I mean, they do, but that's not our problem. That's their problem. Our problem is to try to find out the truth, to get societies to talk about genocide and the victims and that sort of thing, not to worry about what states do. I agree with you absolutely. Katyn, you can have a different take on Katyn, and I want to mention a book, by the way, that relates to everything we've said, which is Jan Gross's and Irina Gross's book called War Through Children's Eyes. Because one of the things the Soviet state did do, I mean, Katyn is in a larger context of an attack against Poles and Polish society in that part of the world. Now, there are different societies, there are different Poles, there are different ways they did it, but there was a whole, Tim talks about in his book as well, there's a whole Polish, murderous program against Poles in the Soviet Union. And Katyn can be seen, as a piece of a larger genocidal action. And when I say genocidal here, the way I use it is not in a legal term at all, but a kind of like genocide. So while I agree that I wouldn't go in front of a court, to say that the Soviets committed genocide against the Poles, the way I would go to a court to say that there's something going on with the Ukrainians in Holodomor, nevertheless, it's part of a larger action against the Poles, which you can see, by the way, through I recommend to you this book very much, because you can see through the eyes of children, how their civilization and culture is being attacked, how, the fathers are being taken away, and the women are then exiled into the Soviet Union and lead a horrible life. Many of them die there. My wife wrote a book about that, Catherine Jolek, about Polish women in Soviet exile. So, you put that whole picture together. Genocide is a larger picture. It's not just, I mean, an event, again, like Babyn Yar is so important and so symbolic and so central. But again, Tim showed this morning. It's part of a bigger picture of a lot of mass murder and killing.
Okay, very quickly, in Poland, when these issues began to be discussed, the government created an Institute of National Remembrance. And I'm wondering if you can, and some other countries have done similar things, I'm wondering if you can tell us some of the lessons of having such an institution in a post-communist country. What have been the positives, what have been the negatives, and are there any warnings that you might offer for the more general audience? Thank you.
So, Professor Margochi, I asked for another hour for an answer. It's difficult. Well, actually, I worked for the Institute of National Remembrance for recent 15 years. And during the last 5 years, I was head of the office of the president. So I know the institution very well. And it's difficult to answer this shortly. Anyway, well, actually, it was coincidence, creation of the institute and the beginning of a Jedwabne debate. But the institute played a crucial role because we addressed the issue in two ways. First of all, it was for a regular, formal criminal investigation, and another one was the research project, which tried to describe and understand the Jedwabne massacre in a broader historical context. I was involved in the other, in the latter project. I was the editor of the two-volume book that was published on Jedwabne. But I go to the second part of your answer, which are the advantages and disadvantages. I think disadvantages are more important. What was the result was the concentrating of our focus on the being victims and repressions, and we forgot a little bit about what was the reasons, extent of engagement of the population in the communist regime. So I think that's the most important. But there are also a lot of advantages. It was a great breakthrough in Polish historiography, particularly the post-war period, but also of the war period after the files of the Polish State Security Service was opened, because it was a very, very important factor in a very, very new volume of sources, which allowed us to understand much more communism and mechanism of the communist system. Thank you.
I think we should all thank the panelists not only for the content of what they said, for the discussion that was possible as a result of their content and your excellent questions, and for the monumental efforts to keep us as close as possible to schedule. And we are getting better and better as the afternoon goes on, and will continue to get better and better so that we will complete and give everyone an opportunity to equal time during a session. We do have a break right now, but we will return, or that is, I hope you'll return, but we will begin at 15:30. But before that, I wish very much to thank on your behalf Professor Philippe de Lara, Professor Norman Naimark, Dr. Krzysztof Persak, Professor Frank Golczewski, and Professor Maksym as both panelists and speakers. Thank you very much, and we will return and re-begin at 15:30. Dziękuję.